In this series, we'll be making a horror game from the ground up and teaching you everything along the way. From researching, theorizing, and prototyping, to main menus, UI, and sound. Join me and follow along to become the master game developer you want to be. Hello everybody and welcome back to creating a horror game from scratch. A very quick TLDR of where I've been. I was taken off of my mental medication. I'm back on different medication now. I've also been desperately trying to get a job as I am now incomeless and quite frankly scared. That is all to say, I'm sorry it's taken this long. I really do appreciate everyone who's been watching this. I want to get more out. Let's do this. So if you remember last time, we made it so we kind of hardwired the radio to just be in our hand. And because of that fact, the crying, or whatever you want to call it, the banshee, is consistently making noise. So what we're going to do is make it so we actually have to pick up the radio and the sound will turn on and off dynamically with it. The first thing I want to do is go into my content browser and take a look at our actors. I'm going to right click and we're going to create a new blueprint class. It's going to be an actor. And we're going to call this the parent item underscore BP for blueprint. And we're going to open that up. On each of these, we are going to need a static mesh, which we can just name that static mesh because it's just going to be there for each of those. And on the event graph, we need to, as of right now, I think we can just delete these or just not even use them. And I think that's okay for now. I'm gonna close that and I'm gonna go ahead and right click it and we're gonna create a child blueprint class. And of course, this one is going to be radio item underscore BP. And because it is a child of the parent item, we should have a static mesh by default, as you can see here. And we're going to make it that radio that we just created, or that we created last time, or I guess it's called walkie. Its position doesn't really matter. However, I think what I'm going to do is try to simulate the physics on these, which basically means gravity will affect it. So on the right hand side, make sure you're selected onto the static mesh. We're going to go down here to physics. We are going to go to simulate physics and we are going to turn that on and we're going to hit compile and save. Then we need to head over to the class settings because this is something that the player is going to be able to interact with. And if you remember, we created an interface that lets us do just that. So if we type in interact, you'll see our interactable interface, and now we can hit compile and save. As of right now, the item doesn't really do anything. It does have the interface, and we can place it into the world, and by the physics, you'll be able to see, oh, we really need to add a flashlight, don't we? I can't see the item. One moment. And so now you can see, oh, it disappeared when I stepped on it. Okay, I know what happened there. We'll fix that. So basically what's happening if this ever happens to you is for some reason the player has the power of 77 semi trucks hurtling at you at 100 miles per hour by default, and I don't understand why, but that is the current default. So whenever I run into it, the physics are there. It's just being plowed into literally another dimension. So now we need to set up our player so it can actually pick up an item and know what to do with that. What we're gonna do is we're gonna actually head over to our first person folder, go into the blueprints and open up our first person character. And something I've started doing, by the way, look at this absolute mess, is I've learned, I didn't know you could do this. You can actually color code this stuff. So for example, this all being the default coding, I'm gonna go ahead and just grab it all. I'm gonna press C and I'm just gonna put default movement coding. And on the right hand side, you can actually do the comment color. And we'll just make the default stuff like a weird green color. And all of a sudden we can start making this make a lot more sense. So this is all line trace stuff. So we can go ahead and just kind of group this all together. We're gonna make one big comment and we're gonna just type in line trace, and I'll make line trace things red because I'm feeling red right now. And this is just some default stuff like getting the brain ref. I like to just kind of not really do anything with that. I will eventually, like if we get like 4 or 5 things, but for now, just having the one be by itself is totally fine. However, we're here to set it up so the player can actually pick up items and the BP first person character actually use those items. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to go over here into our variables, and we are going to create a new one and call it held item. Held item is actually going to be an integer, and we're going to hit compile and save. So now we're going to create a new set of code. And we're going to create a custom event, and we're going to call it get item. Now, get item is going to require an input. Basically, whenever the item calls this function and says, hey, you got item, we need some sort of input so it knows what item that it got. So we're going to call this got item. And what I'm going to do is change this to an integer as well and hit save and compile. Now, what happens whenever we get item? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set held item to whatever the got item is. And now we'll create a bunch of different branches based on whatever this integer ends up being. So, for example, what we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to type in switch on int. And so now this switch is going to change depending on whatever the held item is. So right now you'll see we just have a default pin, but if we have two different items we can pick up, as you can see we've got 0 and 1, we can then just right click and hit remove execution pin on the default. And if it's item 0, we'll run some code. If it's item 1, we'll run some code. For now, we'll say the radio is item 0. So we're going to create a custom event and we're going to type in get radio. So in order for this to work, we need to change some default values. Right now, if you go over to the viewport, you'll see that our radio is there 100, like it's just there by default. So we need to do a couple of things. Click on the static mesh over here in the components hierarchy, and we need to do a couple of things. The first thing we need to do is go up to search and start typing in the word collision. You'll see that it's still got block all dynamic on by default. Whenever we hold an item, honestly, let's just go ahead and put that to no collision. We might turn that on later, but for now, putting it on no collision will be because if we're not holding it, we don't want it to collide with things. The next thing we're going to search for is visible, and we want visible to be turned off by default, and we hit compile and save. And I just had a thought. Held item by default is 0. So actually, whenever we have 0 called, that means we're not holding an item, which means that get radio is actually going to be item 1. And when we get radio, what we're going to do is basically undo what we just did with the visibility. So we'll get the radio SM, we'll pull out from radio, and we're going to type in set visibility, and we want the new visibility to be true. We do not need to propagate to children. And that's pretty much it for right now. I'm not going to create a comment box for this yet. I guess I can for the individual ones. Get item based on item ID and get radio. But I'm not going to make a big one yet because we're probably going to add a bunch more code. So let's get this group of code done, then we'll add the big box to it. Compile and save. Now let's have the radio BP actually work with the code we just created. So as said previously, if you have more boxes than normal, that's because anything within the parent BP is also going to be called. There's no reason to get rid of these. You might as well just leave them for now. But we do need to activate the character BP variables. So what we're going to have to do is create a custom event, and we're going to call it get player ref. We are then going to cast to the first person character, because that's where our variables are located. The first person character is our player character. Then, because we want to access this potentially later, we're going to pull out from here and we're going to promote that to a variable. Now, you can leave it as BP first person character. My favorite naming convention is just doing the player ref or for player reference. And we'll go ahead and comment this out and get a reference to the player character, And then from event begin play, after parent begin play, we will then get the player ref. So we have access to it as soon as the game loads. Compile and save. And now we'll create a custom event that tells the player ref that we have indeed picked up the item. So what needs to happen in order for us to pick it up? Well, if you remember, we have the line trace by channel. So we're going to use that as a way to know if the player is looking at it and used the interact button. So if you remember, what we need to do is type in interacted like that, and we need event interacted. So whenever we interact with it, what we're going to do is we're going to get our player ref that we just got access to, and we are going to type in get item. So now you can see whenever we have the radio item, we can tell the player what item they're getting based off of a number. So for example, we can just type in 1, because if you go back to the player ref, you'll remember 1 is get radio. So now we have got item 1 like this, and we can hit compile and save. And just for good measure, we will also pull out and type in destroy actor, which, as you can see, the target will be self. So whenever we interact with it, it'll appear to immediately pop up in our hand, and the actor will be destroyed, the one that's on the ground. So let's go ahead and comment that. When interacted with, pick up radio. Now we'll hit compile and save. So as of right now, the Banshee Scream does whatever it wants. It doesn't really care if we have the radio or not, but if this is working correctly, when we look at the radio, don't get too close as you remember the semi trucks. If we look at it and we click, if I can, there we go. As you can see, it's no longer on the floor, but instead in my hand. Now what we're going to do is essentially do this for every single item that we end up adding. And a quick warning, how we're doing this works perfectly fine for the small amount of items and small game that we're creating. We're going to put all the static meshes essentially in this exact location and turn them on and off depending on what item we're holding. Now, the reason I'm giving you this caveat is because if this was a large game, this would be very, very unoptimal, because then we've got all the items loaded into our RAM, even though they don't need to be present on screen. So for a small little indie horror game, it should be fine. However, if you get too many items and they're all loaded in at the same time, they might not be present on screen, but they're there, and you could run into performance issues. So as long as you're making a small game that's not super high realistic graphics, this is fine. If you're getting performance issues, consider a different approach to this. However, now we need to tell something to let the Banshee know to stop screaming if we don't have the radio in our hand. So what we're going to do about that is we're going to use something called the game instance, which this is when I need to tell you that the brain ref was essentially my way of using the game instance before I realized what the game instance was. So in this case, I'm actually okay still using this. However, think of the game instance as something like a character sheet in D&D. It doesn't disappear between levels, and if you already have the character sheet created, it's very easy to save it for next time. So if we get to saving and loading, the game instance is going to be extremely helpful. So while I was using the brain BP as a way to kind of have these like ways to control the level flow and global variables and stuff, it's still true to an extent. Like for example, it's still going to find the spawn locations and it's still going to initialize the UI. That's perfectly fine. However, I'm moving away from using the brain BP for stuff I guess I haven't really covered yet. But I still thought it was worth bringing up and letting you know in case I said something in previous ones that is going to all of a sudden change going forward. So let's go ahead and create our own game instance. The game Unreal Engine gives you one by default, but it's not something you should use. What we need to do is go into our blueprints and we need to go into systems. Wait, I did create a game instance. My bad. I forgot I had already used the game instance. It's for our available ghosts. That makes sense. Apparently I was already ahead of myself. We're going to create a variable. We're going to call this player held item. And of course it's going to be an integer, and we're going to hit compile and save. In our first person character, we are not currently getting a reference to the game instance. So we're going to do that real quick. Custom event get game instance ref. Let's go ahead and cast to my game instance. The object is just get game instance. Game instance. We're going to promote that to a variable, and we're going to rename that to game instance ref. And we're going to go ahead and create a comment, get game instance ref. I spelled it wrong again. I'm losing my mind, guys. Then out of the event begin play, we need to make sure it's calling, get the game instance ref. And at the end, or actually not at the end, let's go ahead and make our comment a little bit bigger so we have a little bit more space here. Essentially, right before the switch on int, we also need to get our game instance and set the held item, and then pass it on to do what everything else it needs to do. The reason we're doing it this way is because of performance. It seems inefficient, right? Because we're setting it here and we're setting it here. But here's the reason for that. Every single ghost is going to need a copy of our player with their own game file because they're interacting with each other. That is very inefficient. And that's kind of what casting does, which I haven't really touched on that. But whenever you cast to something, like, so for example, we cast to the brain ref. The brain ref is now loaded in the map, but also it's loaded next to my player in memory. So never cast a ton. And the reason this actually works is because we're casting to a game instance that is already in memory. So in this case, it doesn't create any extra craziness. So by not attaching the player and the ghost together, and instead using the game instance as a medium, we're actually increasing performance. I hope that made sense. I've had to rethink this a couple times. Sorry if that was a weird jump. All I've done is set the player held item and connected it to the change player held item. Don't worry about this event dispatcher. I've decided to go against that. And instead, we're going to get all actors of class. And what we're going to do is look up our parent ghost. Like that. And then out of the array we get, we're going to type in for each. And now we need to go into the parent ghost and actually set up something that this calls whenever we do this. Now this is actually the incorrect way to do it, and I'm letting you know that because I don't know the correct way to do this. So if someone knows the correct way to do this, please let me know. This is very inefficient. We might even see an FPS drop when we switch items. I'm not 100% sure, we'll see. But if you know better, leave a comment right now and I will heart it, thumbs it up, let everyone know in the next episode even. Right now, this is how we're gonna do this. So let's go into our parent ghost and we're gonna create a custom event. And we're gonna call it item change. So essentially, anytime the item changes, what we're going to do is change what it is that we're currently able to do. In this case, we're gonna check the is crying. Let's go ahead and get an input, item, and integer. Compile and save. I'm gonna go ahead and cut this. This is just the start crying code we did in the last episode. We're gonna bring this down here because we also essentially need to create one that is going to stop the cry. We can leave is crying to true, but what we need to do is take crying and stop it. So the first thing that needs to happen anytime we have an item change is any event that only happens if we're holding a current item needs to end. So for example, regardless of the next item, what we need to do is we need to pull out of item change, and we just need to stop the cry. Then we will look at the item. So for example, we will do another switch on int. So now we'll look at the item. Let's add a couple pins to make this a little easier to look at, so it's not going behind the node. We'll add 2 pins because, as you remember, 0 is nothing, whereas 1 is our radio. If it is the radio, we can start the cry. Okay, let's go ahead and compile and save. Let's head back to the game instance, and remember, it's going to look for all the ghosts, and for each item in the array, from array element, we're going to call item change. And you'll plug in the loop body for that. And in this case, we can drag this to here, because we already know what the item is. And now all the ghosts will be notified whether or not we are holding the radio. Now this will be a little bit more clean once we get a couple more items, but for now, it should by default work. The only problem I'm thinking is on the parent ghost, are we not just immediately telling it to cry? Yes, we are. So we need to delete this out. And so now it shouldn't immediately start crying. It'll only start crying if we switch items and the item is the radio. It'll start a cry. If we don't have the radio, which we currently can't not have it unless we don't pick it up, it shouldn't cry at all. So let's give it a shot. So if I hit play, no crying. Let's get kind of close to the radio without plowing it and hit click, if I can manage to actually click it. And as you can see, it didn't start crying. Ah, that's right. We unplugged this. So this is in the first person character. So on the game instance ref, we're going to type in change player held item. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plug in the got item to the player held item and then go to the switch on int. And we're going to hit compile and save. And now it should work. Let's go up to the item, see if I can pick it up. And now, as you can see, I'm not holding the radio, so that's something we'll have to look into. But the ghost was notified to start crying. Let's see why I'm not holding the radio. And there it is, very simple solution. Make sure the held item is plugged to the switch on int so it's not just running 0. Because anytime you get none, fun fact, it's actually getting a 0. So let's go ahead and hit compile and save. And now everything should be hooked up. Okay, we don't hear any ghost cries. Perfect. So we hit left click. We now have the radio in hand. And we can hear the ghost crying. Perfect. So in the next episode, we will figure out how to drop the radio and make sure that it doesn't just despawn. But for now, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please consider donating to my Patreon. It'll help me get these out faster and feed my face, which is always good. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.